Hello and welcome into another episode of the Hecklers Podcast. I am your host, Gordon Coletto, and joining me, as always, is our complainer in chief, Billy. Billy, how are you? Happy 4th.
Went a little too hard yesterday celebrating the fourth, so just trying to take today and recover a little bit.
I totally get that. I am recovering myself, but not for reasons similar to you. But I actually was up late last night catching up on Hard Knocks, watching the first episode of the Giants on Hard Knocks. And I know we talked about this previously, and I had said that I'm, not really a fan of the series, but with that said, I actually really enjoyed the first episode. So I actually want to start off things today with like a quick discussion about the episode and some of the things that I found interesting. Because like I said, I thought it was actually pretty good. So the first thing that really stood out to me was the candidness of Joe Shane, the GM, when talking about the situation with Daniel Jones and like what that situation has done to them financially. And this really came up in the context of Saquon Barkley. So they were talking about like, oh, do we want to re-sign him? Do we want to tag and trade him? Do we want to just let him test his value on the open market? And I think it was John Mora, the owner of the team, comes in and he's like, well, or the, president, CEO, whatever. He comes in and he's like, oh, like I really don't feel comfortable letting Saquon out of the building until we figure out offense without him, right? Like until we can figure out an offense with Daniel Jones that actually works. And I thought that that was interesting. So I'm curious your thoughts on, do you agree? And then, Joe Shane, his response was basically, look, we've paid Daniel Jones, like we can't do anything about that. Like we just have to try to win with the guy. We have to try to build around him and give him a couple years to figure it out, or we need to move on. And I'm curious your thought about that whole situation with Daniel Jones and if you think the Giants are right to try to build around him and give him a chance, or if you think the ship has already sailed at this point.
I think the ship has sailed. So in the 2023 offseason, when they franchise tagged Saquon and they signed Jones to a big deal, it should have been the reverse, right? Where they should have signed Saquon to a deal and franchise Daniel Jones because that's what the franchise tag is for. Let's give it to this player who showed a little bit of promise. We don't know what he is. We don't want to commit to him long term, so we're going to give him the franchise tag. And there's no such thing as a bad 1 year deal. And then we'll have our best player, Saquon, or at least our best offensive player, under contract for the next few seasons. But instead, they signed Daniel Jones to this big deal. They franchise tag Saquon. They don't make much of an effort to bring Saquon back, and he signs with a division rival who's probably, he'd be in a better position with the Eagles, considering their offensive line's better, the talent around him is better, than he was with the Giants. And so you could have had, so last season, if they had franchise tag Jones and they had signed Saquon, would have played out exactly the same, right? So Jones gets hurt, Saquon keeps playing. So now you could sign Jones to a 1 year prove it deal and have him, Saquon, and Malik Neighbors. Well, now you have Daniel Jones on this big deal and a rookie wide receiver in Malik Neighbors, and the run game's not nearly as good. Now they do have an out for Daniel Jones after this season. I don't remember exactly what the contract numbers are, but they can get out of his contract. But they just fumbled this whole thing from the beginning, and I don't know if it was, did the GM and coach say, "Hey, Daniel Jones is our guy," or did the owner say, "Hey, you need to sign this guy to a long-term deal?" It's not really something that I know, but it's put them in a really bad spot and hurt their potential for the future.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think if you it would have been nice to have HBO there last season when they were deciding on the Daniel Jones deal and the Saquon deal. And Shane actually kind of referenced like the talks with Saquon last season and how it took a year off of his life because it was just so stressful and they couldn't come together. So like, without knowing the internal struggle of trying to get Saquon on a deal last year, like franchise tagging a running back with an injury history instead of giving him a long-term deal doesn't bother me on its own. But I do agree with you that like the franchise tag exists for guys like Daniel Jones, for guys that you need an extra year to evaluate before you're willing to sign them to a long-term deal, right? We saw this with Kirk Cousins. I believe we saw it with Dak Prescott, right? These guys who are good quarterbacks, but you need a little bit more time before you're willing to commit. And the through line with Dak and Kirk is that things got really contentious, right? That happens when you sign quarterbacks to franchise tags. But the difference is, the Commanders, then the Redskins, were not able to smooth things over with Kirk Cousins, and he left. The Cowboys were not able to smooth things over with Dak, but ended up paying him more than they would have, and were able to keep him around, right? So it is tough, right? Like, you don't want to piss off your franchise quarterback or a potential franchise quarterback, but at the same time, like, you have to have the interest of the franchise in mind. If you franchise tag Daniel Jones, you protect yourself from a huge fall off or this massive injury that happened, right? Because, and here's the thing too, it's not like Daniel Jones had been a fantastic quarterback up to that point. Even coming off that 2022 season, right? That was his best season by far, and they were still 9-6. And he had only thrown for 3,200 yards, 15 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and he added 7 more on the ground, so it's essentially 22 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. To me, like, that's not enough to warrant the amount that he got. Like, it was definitely an overpay, and it was definitely a panic move, it felt like. And it really should have been a franchise tag. It should have been a franchise tag opportunity. They should have, in hindsight, paid Saquon Barkley and franchise tagged him. But I understand franchise tagging Barkley in that moment, if that was the only way to keep him around.
And
Um,
going off of what you said with Dak and Kirk Cousins, those quarterbacks are in a completely different class than Daniel Jones, right? Like, those guys are legitimate starters in the league at worst. And when they're playing fantastic, I mean, more so Dak than Cousins, but they've been in MVP conversations.
sure, sure.
Cousins more as like a loose outside chance,
But
but I mean, Dak was squarely in that last year.
in terms of when you were though looking to get extra eyes on them and extra tape to be able to make a decision about their contracts, at that point they weren't the established starters that they are now.
No, but they were still significantly better
Yes.
than Daniel
No,
Jones.
absolutely. I think too though, the thing with Daniel Jones is always the rushing, of course, though, right? Like, we can't discredit that his
No, you're
passing
right.
numbers will always be a little bit lower. But I do agree, like, Daniel Jones in an ideal world is just an okay quarterback that's going to need a lot around him, even at his best, right? So it's like, either way, it's an overpay based on our standard for what we like in quarterbacks and what we think you should pay for, right? Like, we've had this discussion with Tua, we've had it with Trevor Lawrence, we've had it with Dak Prescott, right? Like, we want winning quarterbacks. We want guys who are going to change the game for you, and that's just ultimately not what Daniel Jones is. So much like Daniel Jones as a starting quarterback in the league, I believe that this ship has sailed as far as this conversation. So let's move into our second piece coming out of the Hard Knocks tape that I wanted to talk about, which was, I feel like I always glorify the off-season process for NFL franchises, and I think that GMs are like much more strategic than they actually are. Like, I was watching this and thinking to myself, this is the same thing that you and I do in party chats while playing our Madden franchise mode. Like, they're just doing the same things. They're literally looking at free agents and being like, okay, this is how I rank them. This is what I need. This is what I can afford. Like, it's literally the same discussions that we have. So it got me thinking, I could potentially be an NFL GM. Now, I know that when shit hits the fan in Madden, I just start a new franchise. Obviously, you can't do that in real life. But the question I have for you is, do you think you could be an NFL GM? And if so, what would your style be? Are you going to be like a fuck them picks guy, or are you going to like develop talent in house? Just kind of basically just be your own farm system and just keep bringing talent up.
I would 100% be an NFL GM. And I think I would lean more to the developed talent in house, but I would be willing to trade up to get my guy in the draft. So I think a good example of this, and it pains me to say this, is when the Falcons got Julio Jones. So they gave up their first round pick that year, along with their second and fourth round picks um, in that year's draft. as well as the next year in 2012, they gave up a first and a fourth. And here's what the Browns got with those picks. And I mean, this is the Browns' fault, but they got defensive lineman Phil Taylor, fullback Owen Marsick, and quarterback Brandon Weeden. They traded up their picks in 2012 to get Trent Richardson. So clearly the Falcons won. And I think if I'm building a team, like obviously you need depth and all of that. But if you see a guy and you're like, this guy is going to be a Julio Jones at his position, you got to pull the trigger and get it. I'd rather have one guy who's a superstar and then have three or four more picks, in that draft and take away from next year's draft than to have these guys who, Phil Taylor was fine on the defensive line. Brandon Weeden ended up being a backup. And Trent Richardson was a bust, one of the biggest busts of all time. So, I mean, and you run that risk, right? Because Trent Richardson was supposed to be this great prospect. But we do this all the time when we see, when it's draft time and we look and we're like, this guy's going to be a superstar. And a lot of times it ends up working out. Like there's just this guy where you just instinctively know. And I think if you feel that way about a player, you just got to trade up and get them.
For all the reasons that you just mentioned, I would be a fuck them picks GM. Like, I do not want to have to evaluate college talent and try to project to the NFL. Let me just look at the NFL and see what guys are doing around the league. Like, no. I don't trust myself enough. I don't trust my staff enough. I know that I can watch games on Sunday and figure out who's a good player and who's not, and I'll just trade for those guys. Like, and because you see it too, right? Like, the Browns sucked at drafting for our entire
God, and they
development.
always had multiple first round picks.
Yeah, and it's like you never did anything with those picks, so the picks were completely useless. No, just go trade for guys around the league. You're better off that way anyway. So, I mean, the moral of the story is both of us could easily be GMs. The question is who would get fired first?
Would it ruin our friendship as well? Like we try and make a trade and it
No,
doesn't
no.
go
See,
through?
I think we'd be those GMs that are too close. Like that actually brings up a good point. So when in the Hard Knocks episode 1, it's Joe Shane and Dan Morgan. Is that the GM of the Panthers?
Yeah, former Panthers linebacker
There you
and current
go.
GM Dan Morgan.
One of, I believe, Joe Shane's draft picks actually with the Panthers that he scouted. So they have a really good relationship. So they're talking at the Shrine Bowl, I believe. Yeah. Nah, maybe it's the Reese's. No, it's the Senior Bowl. They're talking at the Senior Bowl and they're real close. So they're like just chatting it up and he's like, oh, do you want to move up to 6 from 33? And Morgan's like, no, like if anything, I'm moving back. And then he's like, do you want to trade 2 firsts for Brian Burns? And then Shane's like, oh, he's for sale. And then that kind of like kicks off the whole Burns trade discussion. I think we'd be more like that.
But inevitably one of us is going to try and screw over the other one.
Oh, of course.
And yeah,
It's like fantasy football. What I did to John last year, trading for who? Oh
and for
God,
for our listeners, John is another good friend of ours that we're in multiple fantasy football leagues with.
sure, yeah, I should have included that. So what did I mean, I traded him like Tutu Atwell for Terry McLaurin and some other receiver. But the point is, just completely took him to the woodshed on that one.
Oh,
I
fleeced
would
him.
do that to you though. I'm not above that.
You would try to.
Yeah. So the Brian Burns thing is actually interesting. So part of the first episode is them evaluating the pass rusher market. And they have Chris Jones as the number one. I think that's like, yeah, that's pretty obvious. And then they had Burns and Wilkins as like the two guys that they were genuinely considering with of course Dexter Lawrence like really pushing for his former college teammate in Wilkins. So I'm curious your thoughts on like, does that make sense to you in terms of those two guys being guys that they were considering and Chris Jones being just an obvious number one? Like, does that all track?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, Christian Wilkins is a little older than Brian Burns. Looking up their ages right now. So Burns just turned 26. Um, and I'm not sure how old Christian Wilkins is, so that could have played into it
Yeah,
in terms
Christian
of
Wilkins
trading.
is currently 28 and 196 days. So about what
And he'll be
20,
29 in
28 times.
December. So, I mean, he's older than Burns. Um, so I guess in terms of they weren't going to get Jones, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like we all knew he was going back to the Chiefs. So out of Burns and Wilkins, I would give the slight edge to Burns just because he was younger.
Well, and Bowen, the defensive coordinator that they brought in from the Titans, so he's like introducing the front office, like the scouting department, the pro scouting department to his scheme and like what he's looking for in players. And one thing that he talked about was like on the defensive line, we want four guys that can get after the quarterback. And the reality is like Christian Wilkins is a really good run stopper, and he's had fairly fairly pedestrian sack numbers, 1.5, or sorry, 2, 1.5, 4.5, 3.5, and then he spiked up to 9 this year. But like those are fairly pedestrian sack numbers. So I think Burns fit more of what the defensive coordinator was asking for. So I think with that piece of information, it definitely makes a lot of sense as to why they would lean Burns over Wilkins. But I do love Wilkins as a run stopper. Like I think that's either way. Like I don't think that they could have made a wrong decision there by choosing one of those two guys for what they need, but it was interesting, I thought. So I just wanted to bring that up. But I will not take the entire podcasting time to talk about Hard Knocks. Everyone can go and watch it for themselves on HBO Max. I believe new episodes are going to be coming out on Tuesdays. So I'm going to try to get on a good schedule with watching those as they come out, so I'm not behind the 8 ball and seeing everything on Instagram and having it spoiled for me. So let's dive into our second topic of the day. I saw an article, because this time of year people love to just publish nonsense. I saw an article that had said that the Eagles had won the offseason, and I know that you have previously been really skeptical of their ability to offset some of those key pieces that they lost. So I'm curious if you if you still feel that same way given the totality of the offseason, and if it's not the Eagles, who do you think did win the offseason?
So my big thing about what the Eagles lost in this offseason, um, obviously Jason Kelsey on the field. I mean, one of the best centers of our lifetime and probably of all time. But the leadership that they've lost, I've mentioned Fletcher Cox, Jason Kelsey, those are big time leaders for that team. And, players are going to step up eventually and fill that void, but who are those players? What are their personalities? How does that impact the team? That's kind of what I'm concerned about. And we're banking on some of their draft picks finally, living up to the hype. Not that they haven't been fine to good players, but, taking that next step into being a great player. And we're still waiting on that. For me, the team that had the best offseason was the Lions. So I think it's about keeping their core together. They re-signed Goff. They re-signed Amon-Ra. They re-signed Penei Sewell. And then you look at free agency. They added some pieces on defense. DJ Reader, Marcus Davenport, Carlton Davis to help with their secondary. And then they bolstered what is a top 5 offensive line and could be even higher on that list, but they add guard Kevin Zeitler. And then on top of that, they drafted Terrion Arnold in the draft to help with their secondary again. So I think they, on top of their foundation, the pieces that they've added, they've just had such a good offseason.
I like that choice. I know you've been singing the Lions' praises all off season so far, especially as we've gone back and forth on Packers versus Lions. But I do agree. I think they had a really good off season in terms of just adding into what they already had to continue to try to improve and continue to make themselves a threat to compete for the title. So I think that'll be one of the most entertaining divisions in football, because I'm actually going to go with the Bears as my team that won the offseason. So I felt like the draft fell perfectly to them. I thought they added a ton of really high quality players to really build out a well-rounded roster like we haven't seen for the Bears in God knows how long. The question for me, of course, is going to be like, are they going to be able to repeat the defensive performance that they have, and like, can they get a little better? I think the only real notable defensive addition this year was Kevin Byard, and he's obviously a Madden nightmare, but also a nightmare on the field. So I really like that piece. But then, of course, on offense, like Keenan Allen, DeAndre Swift, you get Caleb Williams in the draft, you get Rome Odunze in the draft, you bring in Gerald Everett, you've got new offensive linemen coming in. Like, they are investing in the offensive side of the ball in a way that the Bears have never done. So I'm really excited about what they're doing in Chicago. I think for anybody who's a fan of football, the idea of having a good Bears team feels a little foreign at this point, but you love to see those historic franchises be good. So I definitely think the Bears are a big winner, and I really do hope it pays off for them, because I think we could have a really fun battle up there in the NFC North. The other thing I wanted to ask is we've said who we think are the biggest winners. Who do you think are the biggest losers? I'll let you go first on this one.
So I think the Dallas Cowboys are the biggest loser of this offseason. Their biggest signing was Ezekiel Elliott. And, the pieces they've lost, Tony Pollard, they've lost, his name's escaped me, the left tackle, who signed with the
Smith?
Jets. Yes,
Yep.
they lost Smith, who has injury problems, but when he's on the field, even though he's getting up there in age, he's still fantastic. And so what are we doing to help win a Super Bowl? We just hoping for the best. We hoping other teams get injured, because they got worse this offseason. And even though, I've had my criticisms about the Eagles, they're better this year than they were last year. So, they've improved. I think the turmoil that the Eagles had last year isn't going to be as bad this year. There still might be some, but it won't be as bad. So you might not even win your division. The 49ers aren't going away. The Lions aren't going away. The Packers are getting better. What are we doing as the Cowboys?
I mean, I get what you're saying. Here's the thing. As somebody who was desperate for an offensive tackle in this last draft, Tyler Guyton is somebody who I think is going to plug in day one and really continue this trend of, like, the Cowboys just absolutely crushing their offensive line picks. Like, he's an absolute stud. So, like, I don't think the fall off at left tackle is going to be very drastic at all, if any.
But it's still a fall off.
Hell, they might even get better if he's able to stay healthy all year. You look at their defense. They really haven't lost anybody on defensive significance that I can tell just looking at it. Like, it's still, the biggest questions, of course.
They lost Van Der Esch. He had to retire.
Well, again, health issues. Like, that's not the end of the world. And you have Eric Kendricks. So, the thing is, what I don't understand, and I think for the Cowboys, like, this is the season, right? Like, you have to figure out your Micah Parsons situation. You have to figure out your Dak Prescott situation. You have to figure out your CeeDee Lamb situation. Like, those are the tough decisions that I think are going to define where that franchise is for the next decade.
But you watch, I guess more my point is, you watch the teams around you are getting better. The Eagles are better. The Lions are better. The Packers are better. And you did nothing. They're worse on the field than they were to begin last season.
But how many times have we said that about the Chiefs recently? Where it's like, you lose Tyreek Hill, you're not doing these things, and then it's just like, they just keep coming back and they're great.
Cowboys don't have Patrick Mahomes. The Cowboys could very well still win their division.
Why am I defending the Cowboys?
I don't know. Because they're not as good as they were last year.
It's gross. I feel dirty doing it.
It's pretty disgusting. Now, and I don't support it.
In order to prevent myself from gagging from having to defend the Cowboys, I am going to move into my biggest loser, and I'm not going to go with a team. I'm going to go with a player, and I'm going to say Josh Allen, because he has been thrown to the wolves, and he is going to be expected to carry that team, and I'm not so sure that he's going to live up to it. Like, the spotlight has been on him, but he's had really good supporting cast around him. It's time to shine. Like, all the pressure is there. Your team has said, look, if you're the guy, you're going to be the guy, and you're going to go win with who we give you. And you're not going to get, because I love Keon Coleman. He's somebody that I think is going to be really good in the league, right? But it's like, you're not going to have your CD or your Stephon Diggs. You're not going to have your Gabe Davis, right? You're going to make do with a rookie receiver that we took in the second round, and you're going to, make do with this tight end and running back who I love, right? But I think that Josh Allen is set up to have to do a lot this year, and I don't know that he's ready to live up to that. So for me, Josh Allen was a big loser from this offseason.
But Josh Allen fantasy owners, big winners.
Yeah, I could see that. I
He's
could
going to
definitely
have to
see that.
run the ball.
He's going to have to run the ball, right? Those rushing stats are going to come back up because I think they tried to run him less and it was just not as effective. So I think those rushing stats are going to come back up. In the spirit of the offseason and in this sort of list mode season, I do want to get your opinion on your top 3 NFL front offices in no particular order, right? So we've talked about Joe Schoen and the Giants. We know that they've made some questionable decisions. So who are the 3 teams that you think are doing it right?
I mean, I think you have to start with the Chiefs, right? They've won 3 Super Bowls in the past 5 seasons. To me, they're the obvious team to have on this list.
Absolutely.
Now,
And I think not to cut you off, but I have the Chiefs.
no, go
I have
for
the
it.
Chiefs on my list too, and I just think like obviously having a guy like Patrick Mahomes makes it easy, but I think that they've made some very difficult decisions, and they've made the right decisions when those difficult decisions have been presented, particularly with Tyreek Hill, and then you see they get Rashee Rice, and he's looking like a burgeoning star, but then that's not enough for them. They go and get Xavier Worthy. They seem to have hit with Isaiah Pacheco, and then of course that defense has just been built up quietly over the last all these seasons where they've been really good and making these deep playoff runs. They've been using those late draft picks on really good quality defenders that you can get late in the draft, and they've just built out that defense through the draft, and it's incredible. So I absolutely think the Chiefs are the premier organization in the NFL right now.
yeah, I mean, you just can't not have them on this list. They've been too good for too long. It's sort of like, the Patriots back in the day. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even though Bill he couldn't draft a wide receiver to save his life, they were always up there. So how can you not include them?
You can just keep talking about the Patriots. I'm fine. I'm happy to
No,
listen.
I'm done. That was
Okay.
disgusting.
Well,
Um, my next team, and again, this is in no particular order, but I've got the Eagles. And so, I mean, just think about they built a team around Carson Wentz that was so good. They won a Super Bowl with their backup quarterback, Nick Foles, against your Patriots.
okay.
Because the team was so good.
That's where I don't need you to bring up the Patriots, but keep on going.
And then, they draft Jalen Hurts in the second round. And what do? They built the team up around him again. Um, and they're very aggressive. They go get the guys that they want. I would love for the Panthers to have a front office like that. And then to round out my best front offices, I've got the Ravens. They're just always good. It doesn't matter where they draft. Guys always step up. They draft and develop. They know what they're doing. And I mean, I don't understand why more GMs don't come from that team. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
So I actually picked 2 teams from those 2 divisions as well, but I'll quickly riff on the 2 that I think you chose. I do think mine was kind of an oversight in not picking the Eagles. They have been a really well run organization, and they have really built up that team a lot like what we've talked about with the Chiefs, except they've done their defensive picks really high in the draft, and they've really built out a really good defense through the draft. And then, of course, the offense, really came from hitting on Jalen Hurts, and then you do a good job with Devontae Smith, you get him, and there's good value there, and then you make the big move for AJ Brown. So I do think, and of course Dallas Goedert as well. I don't recall where they got him or how they got him, but it's still it's a really well built team, so I'll give you that. But my team from that division will be the Cowboys, who we've talked about. But like honestly, the Cowboys have never really been bad. So like I don't know how you can say that as much as we hate Jerry Jones, like I don't know how you can say that it's not a premier front office because
And
they've
they're
kept
very
that.
good at getting top end talent.
Yeah. Like how many guys just go there and are just so friggin' good? It's like Micah Parsons, like just really like you end up with probably the best player from that draft, and then it's like you get these offensive linemen, and it's like Zach Martin, and it's like damn, like how do you keep doing this? CD Lamb, even even Dak Prescott, like getting that value for that guy, like where you got him was awesome. And then it's like I don't know, that organization, as much as I hate them and as much as I don't like the Cowboys, they are incredibly good at what they do. And it's a lot of expectations too. That's the other part of it. Like the Cowboys brand is so big that the expectation game is huge, and they don't miss. Like I just think that's really something to be proud of as a Cowboys organization. So the other team I chose, to your Ravens pick, I chose the Steelers, and I know that recent success has eluded them in terms of building out their roster, but what I would say is you look at what they've done outside of Kenny Pickett, which I think was sort of a panic reaction to losing Ben Roethlisberger and being presented with quite possibly the worst quarterback draft class since 2020. Like this just I don't know. This to me, this team just seems to find ways of just finding quality players up and down the draft, and especially at receiver. We talked about this at length, right? They just seem to be a receiver factory. And the best part of all is that they know when to move on from guys. Like you look at Antonio Brown, you look at Le'Veon Bell, like they just seem to have a way to get the best out of guys when they're in their system, and then when it's time to let them go, whether it's Juju Smith-Schuster, Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, and probably Deontay Johnson, sorry Panthers fans, they just know when to cut bait, and I think it's really cool. And like you with the Ravens, I'm surprised you don't see more teams plundering the Steelers front office for GMs, assistant GMs, scouting departments. Like the Steelers have just been an incredible organization throughout my whole lifetime. So I don't know how they wouldn't be included in a list, but of course, recent success tends to skew people's opinions. So, but I think they're on the right path though with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields and trying to figure something out and moving on from Kenny Pickett. Having again, it's like how many teams do you see that just aren't willing to cut bait on a bad player like Kenny Pickett? They were just like, screw it, we'll do it. You know?
Yeah, I mean, to their credit, because I was going to say quarterback is that position where, and it's only been a couple seasons since Ben retired, but they haven't hit on anyone. But I mean, like you said, to their credit, they were just like, he's not it. We're moving on. More teams need to do that, but
And I mean,
at least they can recognize it.
outside of the Packers, there's very few examples of teams that have managed the transition from one franchise quarterback, to the next. Like most teams don't do that, right? Like most
I
teams,
can't even think of another. I mean, I guess you could say Joe Montana and then Steve Young,
sure, yeah, and it's like, you know,
Philip Rivers to, I
and
guess Drew Brees, Philip Rivers to Herbert.
maybe you look at like Alex Smith, Patrick Mahomes, right, where it's like you have a guy who is in
Yeah,
that
but
great.
Alex Smith wasn't a franchise
Well, I
quarterback.
understand
You
that,
also
but
look at Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck.
sure, but Alex Smith was in that sort of Kirk Cousins mold that we're talking about, right? Where it's like he's good enough, right? Like you can make it to the playoffs with Alex Smith. Um, and it's like it's easy to sit on a guy like that and then never make a plan to move on, right? But they saw the talent in Patrick Mahomes and they took him, right? And it's like very few teams do that, right? So they just got caught with their pants down. They didn't have an exit strategy for when Ben left. Which is a little bit foolish because those last few seasons, like it was obvious that he was not going to give you much for much longer. Um,
I just think it's tough when you have one of those legendary guys. And it's, I mean, the Packers have done it where they just draft him.
yeah.
But I think it's tough when you have one of those legendary guys to be like, all right, we're just going to take your successor and not try and help you win.
Well, and we saw what that did in Green Bay, right, to the relationship. But I mean, but I think at some point though, like you have to know I'm going to cut bait with Ben Roethlisberger in the next 2 years anyway. So if I piss him off, who cares, you know?
Right.
But I mean, and that's again easier said than done. Like we talked about, not many teams are able to navigate that transition. Most teams are not. So let's um let's kind of round out this list season episode with kind of a fun topic, something that came up for us this week. I want you to give me your top three football nicknames of all time, and then for fun, give me one from outside of football.
Can I do a couple from outside of football? Because I have a
Sure,
few
whatever
that
you
I
got,
just
as
really
long as you
like.
don't steal mine.
All right. So I've got a list, and I'm glad you sent me your list of nicknames first because I had a few of those on there. So I'm going to skip over those. So I have Terrence Knighton, who's a defensive tackle. His nickname was Pot Roast. I just think that's amazing for a defensive tackle, and
Mm.
he was a large man, so the nickname really fit. Um, Kind of torn between a couple. Um, so I'm gonna go with Calvin Johnson as Megatron,
Yeah, that was cool.
and then I dug deep for this one. Christian Okoye. His nickname was the Nigerian Nightmare. I thought that was awesome.
That is cool. I like that. That's one, I love the alliteration, and two, like I just think that's a cool like that instills fear.
That one's such a good nickname.
All right, let me throw mine out there. You tell me which ones you had on your list as we go. The first one I have is Jerome Bettis, the bus. Was it on your
Didn't
list?
have him. No, didn't
Oh
have him. I
man.
thought about it, but he didn't make the cut. I'll tell you my whole list.
Here I'll keep rolling here.
Yeah,
We've got Jerome Bettis, the bus, right? Just the physical run style, the large frame, like that dude. That was cool. And then I got Greg the Leg Zerlian.
that was the one I had.
Okay, because you know I love a kicker.
Such a good nickname.
I mean, and if you're a kicker, Greg the Leg, I mean, come on. That's awesome. And then the last one I have is a player from my childhood that, like, I don't know. For some reason, this guy lives in my head rent free. I don't know about you, but
No, he doesn't.
really, especially as a
No,
Panthers fan, it doesn't stick with you. The player, of
he
course, I'm
wasn't good
talking
enough.
about is the muscle hamster, Doug Martin.
That one just doesn't do it for me, if I'm being honest.
Ugh. I also see on Pro Football Reference that they have him as Duggernaut, which I kind of like. Um, but come on, the muscle hamster, 5'9",
Nah,
210 pounds, just a little dude who's just built like a damn fridge. Come on.
just doesn't do it for me.
Oh man. Well, that's probably because he was running all over your Panthers.
Okay, you know what? We can move on.
Well, all right. Give me your outside of the NFL nicknames.
All right, so one, loved it since the first time I heard it. Kobe Bryant, the Black Mamba. That's
Mm,
awesome.
I love that. That's cool.
Gotta go back into the past. Babe Ruth. I'm not gonna take Babe because that is his nickname. I'm gonna go with the Sultan of SWAT.
Ooh, yeah.
And then another one that I love, but the player himself absolutely hates, Kevin Durant as the Durantula, or Kevin Durant as the Slim Reaper.
What about Kevin Durant as a bitch baby?
Well, I mean, the implication, we all know that.
Okay, yeah, just making sure. But yeah, Slim Reaper, I like that.
The Slim Reaper, it's like ekes out the Durantula, but they're both fantastic.
If he doesn't want it, do we give it to Chet Holmgren?
Uh, I feel like Wimby would have it before.
Ooh, yeah. Well, see, I'm a Chet guy. That's, you know. Okay. Let me give you mine. So outside of the NFL, you know I'm a NASCAR guy. I'm gonna go with the legend himself, Dale Earnhardt as the Intimidator, the Man
Such
in
a good
Black.
nickname.
Just yeah. And the thing is, I love when a nickname is based off like just their entire persona, right? Like it's the driving style, it's the car, it's the mustache, the aviators. Like that was
It's sort of
cool.
like Kobe with the Black Mamba. Like, I think those kind of go where, like, that was very much Kobe.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. I didn't actually put this on my list, but I want to bring it up because we are both UNC Charlotte grads. But Cedric Cornbread Maxwell. I mean,
Oh, I like that. I mean, with his last name being Maxwell,
oh yeah.
Cornbread just fits.
And I mean, from Kinston, North Carolina, like Cornbread. I mean, it just, come on. And
Yeah, that's
of
a good one.
course, just the most notable UNC Charlotte alumni other than ourselves. So I had to put that out there. Plus a Boston Celtics legend. So +1 for our championship winning 18 champion Boston Celtics. So in conclusion for today, that'll do it for us and for another episode of the Hecklers Podcast. As always, don't forget to rate and subscribe to the show.